It leaves a lot to think about. I mean, when I contrast the first panel, which was very much about, to my mind, how are consumers, well, at least homeowners, part of the solutions to these problems, I think this panel, to my mind, is focused more on how is industry part of the solution to this problem. And I have been told by a very well-acting oil company, if you could say some are better acting than others, that they're ready to act with policy. No one will be first without durable policy. And when I listened to the panelists, I started to think about what other policies, so much of our climate policy has been driven toward consumers, use less, reduce consumption, drive less, all the things that will, in effect, change industrial policy over the long term, but it's kind of a cause and effect, as opposed to some of the mechanisms that were coming out of this talk, which were greater transparency on greenhouse gas inventories so that you can do focal pricing on carbon that really does account for all the emissions from industry, or legal liability, or policy in the financial sector, or PG&E, Chapter 11, bankruptcy of what's going on now in California after the Camp Fire. Are there policies, I'm wondering, toward what you were all talking about that you could imagine that will really seize the ultimate drivers of what we're seeing?
So, I like the carbon tax. I have to say that because I'm an economist. But I do actually think there's a way to craft a carbon tax that navigates the politics. I think we have seen public policy in the U.S. Change incentives for some in industry, but some of those are not policies that we can keep on the books forever. And some that come to mind are some of the subsidies that we've used. And I think when we look at what's happened in the U.S. power sector in the last decade, it's really two stories to explain what's happened to coal. Part of it has clearly been the fracking and natural gas, and dramatic collapse in natural gas prices that makes it very attractive to the power sector. That's probably about 60% of the reduction in CO2 emissions. But about 40% is the big push out in wind and solar. And that's because we've been subsidizing those technologies. The challenge is those subsidies, when we first put those on the books, they didn't cost that much. But when you're actually building a lot and you're still subsidizing it, it starts to add up. And I don't know if it's, for one thing, I have a concern of, is that, are we really targeting our subsidy dollars effectively? But there's also just the political economy. At some point, you just can't take on that bill and have the taxpayer underwriting all this investment. So we have seen some of that there. There have been efforts to try to use the Clean Air Act, more successful in combination with fuel economy standards to go after vehicles than to go after industry. But what I look at is that in the long term, when I look at what's happened to the U.S. energy economy, there are a couple of really important changes that mean that the traditional definitions of industries have changed, than how we crafted the Clean Air Act in the 70s, or the energy bills that promote appliance efficiency or promote vehicle efficiency. And because those industry definitions are getting a little bit more amorphous, and recognizing that we may have a future in which electricity is competing with oil to power vehicles, I don't think we necessarily want to continue a traditional industry-specific approach. I also think there's some risk with our continued approach, like say with subsidies, that's very much technology-specific. And I think that's why there's something very appealing that says, I don't know exactly what the answer is in terms of reducing our emissions, but I want to create the incentive for some really clever entrepreneurs, some really progressive companies, anyone who wants to make a buck, to go out there and to do it. And to be able to do something like a price on carbon that just says, go be creative. You know, it's the thing that's the reason why economists keep sort of pushing on this. And at some point, once we've exhausted all other policy options, we might actually see it happen. But I think that if we're really talking about decarbonizing the foundation of the modern economy, not just here but around the world, you have to take truly an economy-wide approach to create those incentives to look everywhere in the economy to reduce our emissions.
Any others?
Well, I maybe want to follow up here is that I think the real problem is that without policy, many companies were not allowed to do something. So there is some big movement now of activist shareholders which are trying to push fossil fuel companies to disclose how they're going to react to a 2-degree world. How would they change their business model, their investments, if climate policy was in place? And I think that's very good, and there's more transparency to understand what are they really planning for. Are they planning for a 5-degree world? Are they planning for a 2-degree world? But when it comes down to it, and I think that's what Joe just said, is that you would be a really bad CEO if you're planning for a 2-degree world exclusively. I mean, you are actually probably liable in some kind of litigation because you're not doing your job. If you're the head of BP or ExxonMobil, you're there to make sure that your company is profitable. And if there's a market for oil, you should serve that market better than your competitors in order to make money, and that's what the CEO of the company is supposed to take care of. And so I think that's in a way the gridlock. On the one hand, they would be willing to move, but they're not moving. And I think there are other aspects that we're going to hear about later about the sociology of all of it, which we're not talking invested interests and stuff like that. But I mean, there is, I think, again, as an economist, I think there's a great power of the market that can be harnessed in changing the trajectory, but the incentives need to be right. And that's why I put so much effort on technology, because I think that if to be successful, renewable energy needs to be cheap and abundant. And I think that if technologies are going in that direction, we have to thank the German consumers for being willing to subsidize, pick up the tab for such a long time and make it cheaper. And anyway, thank the Chinese citizens for suffering through bad air for so long, for the government then coming and roll out these massive investments that make it cheaper for us today to use it and for them to become competitive. And I think successful policy would be to look at making it cheap and abundant so that then it's taken up. And how specifically, I mean, I don't know the US context well enough to say that, but I think that's what we need to get to.
I would just add, like, at least from just one fact from our research that we find is that, so sometimes we focus on like oil industries and high emitters, but if we, for instance, in our paper, if we take out all these industries and we just look at what's happening to valuation in these other industries that are not related to fossil fuels, they would benefit immensely from like a carbon tax. So sometimes we think like these are the ones that are taking down the equity valuations because of potential climate policy or a potential carbon price, but other industries are going to benefit immensely.
And just quick second question before we open it, because Timmins, no one's really talked about it, but Timmins showed, I think it was in your opening slides, the reliance on net negative emissions that we're going to have unless we're hitting this cliff very quickly. And I think it was maybe, Armand, in one of your emails to me, I mean, I've been doing a lot of work and thinking a lot about geoengineering and climate engineering. And as scary as the proposition is of that, I think that those are the easier technologies to put in place than getting off oil. And or off coal or off gas. And I was just curious how geoengineering, climate engineering, net negative technologies, and for those that don't know, these are things like sucking carbon out of the atmosphere on the simpler side when it comes to simple, or storing it in the earth and sequestering it, and also seeding, putting things in the atmosphere, putting sulfates in the atmosphere to cool off the atmosphere, acting like an umbrella for the warming that we're doing. There are just a lot of technologies out there, but I'm curious how it affects your policy assessments if there is this kind of quick uptake at some point of these net negative and other technology solutions.
I think if we're going to do 2 degrees C, we're going to need these technologies. It's when I look at just where we already have invested capital, when I think about the political economy challenges of changing, we'll need them. And it has important implications. So I'm talking about sort of what's a focal carbon price for us to think about. And tradition, when people say sort of, well, what's the right price to put on a ton of carbon, and you ask an economist, they say, well, what do I think is the damage of putting another ton of CO2 in the atmosphere? And it completely abstracts away from the prospect that you might do geoengineering that actually reduces that damage. Or you might see some really aggressive adaptation effort. If we actually had the state really get aggressive, what we estimate in our models about sort of the investment that's going on in adaptation is potentially going to be dwarfed by what might be public expenditure. in a future in which we realize that we really have messed up the climate and messed up our local environments dramatically because of climate change. So it does complicate these matters a lot. I think it complicates the matter a lot if you are, say, an energy company, and someone says you need to be focused on a 2°C world, and do they think that means we're really going to see governments put on carbon prices like what comes out of these models, which I wouldn't believe, but like are incredibly high, like the equivalent of tripling or quadrupling the price of gasoline in America? If you're really going to get on a trajectory to limit warming to 2°C, or you say part of how we're going to get to 2°C is because we're going to see geoengineering, and that actually relaxes the constraint on the fossil fuel industries. And I think that those kinds of policy uncertainties makes it that much harder to think through how they plan for what they think could be the eventual policy landscape.
Once again, we'll open up questions.
Oh, I wanted to say something.
Sorry, Glenn.
Sorry, Mark. I just wanted to say that I think that more important than geoengineering are net negative technologies, which are actually the ones you mentioned initially, are the ones that somehow are able to use CO2 for something productive. And I think if we can get to the point, and there are two big companies that are globally in business, and one is ClimateWorks and the other one is Global Thermostat, which develop technologies which have demonstration plans, which have some plants already that are in commercial use, which try to find ways in which taking CO2 out of the atmosphere somehow, there is some processes for this, and providing it into some economic activity which is profitable, then that would be the right way to go. I think geoengineering there are a lot of risks. I mean, we're back to risks. There are a lot of risks associated with that, and it wouldn't really be sustainable in the sense that that measure, once the reflective particles have disappeared, you're back to where you were before, and if you suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere and use it for something where it doesn't go back into the atmosphere, then that will be sustainable in the sense that you shift down the trajectory permanently. And I agree with Joe, there is no other option. If we want to go to 2 degrees, I don't think we'll get around massive deployment of net negative technology towards the end of the century, and that's what the IPCC also said in 1.5 degrees report. And maybe a dirty secret that we also can touch upon very briefly before we open it up is they also say that we need to lower energy use. So in their projections, net negative technology isn't even enough anymore for 1.5, but you need mitigation, you need negative technologies which suck CO2 out of the atmosphere, and you need to starkly disassociate CO2, GDP growth and energy use, which is on an unprecedented scale, and that nobody really knows how this is happening. But so there are a lot of ingredients that already have to go into their projections in order to make it, which basically shows you the challenge that we are facing in order to go to 1.5 degrees.
Questions?
Hi. How do you think that politicians taking money from the fossil fuel industry plays a role in the connection between economic growth and basically societal growth, if you will?
Which is the topic of the whole afternoon. A bit unfair to dump it on the panel, but nonetheless, there you go.
Well, I would say I don't know the U.S. policy context well enough to comment on these questions. So I'll pass it over to my other panelists.
But you're going to comment because of that.
So I think it's actually a complicated question. And the reason why it's complicated is that some of the important innovations we're seeing that have lowered emissions have actually occurred by companies that also have fossil fuel assets. In the end, the shareholders of BP weren't happy about it, but in the 1990s, BP was one of the biggest solar companies in the world. And the reason why the shareholders weren't happy about it is they lost a lot of money on it. They went too aggressively in solar too early, before we really got the technology costs down and saw the rapid growth and adoption of solar over the past decade. So I think it's complicated when we look at, when we think about the fossil fuel companies, because some are, they're investing in the innovation that we're going to need. And some of them really have brought to market technologies that have helped lower emissions. And so I have the benefit of having never held a political office, never run for a political office, And as you might expect of an economist in the ivory tower, never will. But when I look at this, I feel like it's the complexity is sometimes difficult, especially in our media environment today, to do justice to. But I think I care more. There's other aspects about where fossil fuel money is influencing politics than like how do I sort of track donations between companies and politicians. I care more about some of the associations, whether it's some of the trade associations, whether some of the work that's occurred at the state level through ALEC, some of the fossil fuel industries have been involved in. But I also want to know that there are some fossil fuel companies where I think there's really no ambiguity. I mean, there's a few of the coal companies. They are just trying to keep the market alive for their coal. They're not thinking about anything. They're not thinking about clean coal. They're not thinking about carbon capture and storage. Just thinking about a market for as long as possible for the mineral they're bringing out. That's potentially a different than some of the other energy companies I think tend to be more diversified.
Okay, so that we can get across to the next building for lunch and stay on schedule, but 2 questions, and then we'll do the 2 questions, ask you to keep them brief.
One nil.
So how much of what you'd like to do requires a deregulation or more regulation of the utility industry? One of the more fascinating things that happened this summer is when ISO New England was doing its inventory is that what kept peak demand low was behind the meters solar, which was producing 2,000 megawatts of energy in July, which was a phenomenal number and wasn't really reported on. And so what is really required is to change the nature of how we view the utility industry as much as it is for the companies themselves, because the companies will respond to the utility industry.
Time for one more, but I'm actually not going to pass to you because this person had her hand up before.
Thank you. So I'm Angela Blanchard. I'm a senior fellow here, and I'm from Houston, Texas. My work is long-term recovery after disasters, and I've worked through Allison, Katrina, Rita, Ike, Gustav, Edward, and Harvey. A recent story that broke on the Gulf Coast was Motiva's plans to invest almost $7 billion in expanding their refining capacity on the Gulf Coast, which is both in the path of hurricanes and also the actual site in Port Arthur, that's the focus of most of their investment, was majority of it was under 5 feet of water in Harvey. So we really sit at the nexus of the interdependencies and the sort of the cycle of produce more, cause more, climate change, produce more, cause more. But the fact is that this would look like a nudist colony without petrochem. You are wearing petrochem, you are sitting on petrochem, we are wrapped in petrochem. So what I find frightening is the complete lack of understanding of, as Deborah points out, oil and gas and all of the different products that emerge from that industry, because the policies won't be smart unless we have a better understanding of those interdependencies and what we all rely upon. During Harvey, someone helpfully tweeted to me that they rode their bicycle and Houston deserved what we were getting. And I was thinking you'd be riding that bicycle naked with no seat and wheels were it not for petrochem. So how do we educate people in the country about how all of this works? Because policy, which will drive those changes in the market, extends from a public grasp of these issues. And I'm scared.
Final comments from the panel on either of those 2 comments? Are you scared? Or are you just hungry?
I'm not sure.
I'll say 2 quick things. One, we could probably use more deregulation on the economic side in the power sector and more regulation on the environmental side. That I think would actually be a nice combination. I mean, some places like where we are in New England, we've already got a fair amount of the economic deregulation, but there's other parts of the country which could benefit from that. And there's been actually some really fascinating economic research about how much more productive our generating units are when they actually operate in more competitive markets. So, and that, you know, whatever it is you're running, that just means less, if you're having to use less energy to produce power, that's going to be good for the climate. So I think there's a mix there. On this other question about, you know, there's a lot that comes out of a barrel of oil that we benefit, some of which is less transparent than others. I think is the reason why I tend to prefer a technology-neutral, economy-wide price on carbon. Right. Some parts of that barrel are going to be really hard because they're really highly valued to get out of the economy. That ought to be some of the last stuff we get out, and we get out the easier stuff to reduce emissions from first. And so that's why I tend to prefer that as a policy approach in contrast to some of the alternatives.
Yeah, I would go in the same direction in saying I think you don't really have to go to the bicycle seat quite yet. I think there are a lot of other activities that we can get rid of first that cause emissions of CO2. And if you look at how we're doing things in Europe, lifestyle isn't that different, but our CO2 emissions are drastically lower. So I think, as Joe just said, there are a lot of inefficiencies that we can squeeze out first, and then maybe at some point we have to get rid of bicycle seats. I doubt it, but so we shouldn't be that scared. And the second thing is maybe Joe wouldn't disagree with me. Maybe at some point regulation of the utility sector isn't that bad. If you think of a company called Enron, that deregulation in the utilities market could also lead to some inefficiencies, and actually how California, as far as I understand it from the other side of the world, responded to their crisis was to introduce more regulation and introduce basically command and control to some extent to make sure that things are going smoothly. And maybe, I don't know, there are also arguments on the other side. I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think transparency is a really big part of all this. We're told, we started with conference on peak oil. We've carried these tropes with us for a very long time. And the more information we have, I think the smarter we'll be, but also the smarter policy making will be. So I think that the idea of understanding that the oil and gas industry, for one, is more energy intensive than almost any other industry. So not only are they on the side of producing fossil fuels that we're burning, there's a lot of emissions that happen within their gates that they're not going to be priced on carbon because the gas they use to generate their own heat is their gas. So I think that it's going to take a lot more transparency to nip away at this.